Hey everyone, it's OSK. Today we're going to talk about the Tempest class Spellbreak. Tempest is one of the most fun classes to run in Spellbreak due to its high skill ceiling and mobility, and the best Tempests can completely avoid getting hit while dealing some of the craziest damage in the game. In this video, I'll show you all the basics of the class itself, how to use it effectively, and I'll even throw in a few advanced tips towards the end of the video for you. And of course, a special thanks to Talkohsss and Ashenfrost, two of the most prominent Tempest players in the Spellbreak community, for helping me create some of the text that we'll show you later on, and just some tips in general. But before we get started, guys, please consider giving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out when you do that, and if you do like these sort of detailed guides as well as general analysis on the game, maybe you'll like seeing more of it. But with that out of the way, let's get into this. First, let's get into the overview and class identity of the Tempest class. Now, if you've seen or tried out any amount of Tempest gameplay, you would know that the in-game description is pretty much spot on. High flying mobility. Pretty darn accurate there, and one of the best in the game. Good job, Proletariat. Now, as the description suggests, there are plenty of ways to increase your mobility with the Tempest class by using wind jumps, tornadoes, and various momentum transfer techniques that we'll get into later on in the video. But for now, let's get into the Wind Gauntlet itself. First, let's get into the spell of the Wind Gauntlet. The spell of the Wind Gauntlet is called Wind Shear, and it rapidly fires a wide gust of wind that deals decent, reliable damage up close, but falls off in damage significantly, even at mid-range. On the other hand, or I guess the same hand, Wind Sorcery lets you spawn a tornado that sucks in aerial opponents and can be combined with other elements for a small amount of damage. Speaking of combining elements, let's get into that now. First, we'll talk about wind and fire. Wind will blow away every source of fire, including fireballs, fire puddles, and flame walls. Using wind against a fireball, as of the making of this guide, really just shifts its trajectory a little bit, so not the most effective thing in a fight, but it's still there. Meanwhile, using fire on a tornado will change the fireball's trajectory, and the tornado will still provide the suction effect while applying ignite to everyone hit. Similarly, wind will blow away all sources of toxic, but it will leave some toxic gas behind that stays in the area for a while, applying a little bit of damage to everyone who walks through. It will also blow away the toxic cloud projectile, much like it does for a fireball. Toxic into a tornado will spawn a toxic tornado, wow, and apply damage and corrosion for additional armor damage over time. You can also shoot wind shears through your toxic tornado for some extra toxic gas, and toxic sprays will actually converge onto a central point when you fire them through a toxic tornado. And of course, be sure to combine it with fire for a nice explosion. Wind and stone only really interact with their sorceries. Wind shears will blow away boulders quite effectively, and meanwhile, tossing a boulder towards a tornado will cause the boulder to change trajectory by a lot, and some players even use this in the middle of fights to reposition their boulder for some big damage, but this is very difficult. Wind and lightning have simple interactions. Basically, you make a tornado and shoot lightning at it to make a big source of shock CC. You can also shoot wind shears through an electrified tornado to shock your enemies that way and create little shock fields on the ground. And lastly, wind and frost have very interesting interactions. Of course, a tornado will alter the trajectory of an ice lance, but you should also pay attention to interactions against frostborns. Shooting a wind shear to frost trail will destroy the frost trail and provide a slow, and will eventually freeze anyone who stays in the ice mist long enough. And last but not least, we can't forget that the edges of the flash freeze sorcery will completely block wind shear, so be careful with this. Now then, moving on to class skills, Wind Surge is Tempest's bread and butter, and you will get it at level 1. This essentially makes it so that the Wind Gauntlet becomes a permanent rune on your main hand and gives you all the mobility a Tempest could want. With Wind Surge, you can wind jump and impulse off of surfaces, and this gives so many options both in and out of fights. It's such a nice alternative to levitating and provides you with more mana efficiency and also less predictable movement out of just 2 wind shears. Wind Surge also couples very nicely with runes that preserve momentum, like Dash, which allows for some crazy movement in some instances. This skill is very versatile, and when used properly will make you an unhittable speed demon. Tempest's second skill, Updraft, is another very important one, and this allows the user to launch themselves into the air by running into a friendly tornado. This can also be done with toxic and fire tornadoes, but if someone catches you, a dragonfire tornado can be devastating, so be careful. Updraft has some very cool techniques you can use with it, such as tornado bouncing, rady hopping, and tornado potting that we'll get into later, but it's really a nice way for Tempest to stay in the air, especially when they run out of mana. The third skill for Tempest is called Squall, and this is where everything starts coming together. Before level 3, you don't really have any reason to use Wind Surge or Updraft unless you're just trying to zoom through the Hollowlands and dodge incoming spells, but once you unlock Squall, now it all starts to make sense. Basically, by staying in the air for 1 second, you reduce all incoming damage by 10% and increase your spell damage by 20%, and this is so important to a Tempest kit. This makes staying in the air extremely rewarding and basically makes you a highly mobile beefstick if you can play well. The last part of that sentence is crucial. Because of the nature of how Tempest works, you're going to be constantly moving and floating, and you need to be good at hitting mid-air shots. Otherwise, you're not going to get the full benefit of the class, if any at all. Finally, the fourth class skill is Sudden Gust, and if the rest of the class is the cake, then Sudden Gust is just the icing on top. This cuts the sorcery cooldowns in half once you're in the air for at least 1 second, and this is very useful for replenishing your Updraft as well as any offhand skills you might have like Flame Wall or Flash Freeze. This opens up your options a little bit for staying in the air, of course, and should keep your Squall skill active. And that's all the class skills of Tempest, and a few tips on how to use them effectively. We'll get into the more advanced techniques later on, but we need to talk about class builds as of patch 1.2. The first one I'll bring up is currently the preferred build for a lot of competitive players, and that is the high mobility variant with talents Runic Fluency, Fervor, and Escapist, with either a fire or toxic offhand and a dash rune. Runic Fluency is almost a must on Tempest, and in general you want to be as mobile as possible, and having an extra rune charge in your kit definitely helps that goal. Fervor is present in the kit not only as an extra source of DPS from your offhand gauntlet, but it also enables your wind gauntlet to be much more effective as a movement tool with Wind Surge, as your wind shears have their cast speed increased along with every other spell you possess. And of course, with one talent point remaining, Escapist is going to be the better option over Recklessness due to the sheer amount of mobility it offers both in and out of fights. This high mobility variant of Tempest is great to use with Fire and Toxic as a highly mobile dodge tank that can deal increased damage with Squall and can dance around opponents with superior mobility. The reason you don't want to run Frost with this build is simply due to the fact that Frost's charge up animation not only slows your horizontal mobility, but it also does not get any benefit from Fervor, making the build a little lackluster for sniping, but we'll cover a better build for that sort of flashy play right now. This Frost variant of Tempest is a little bit more of a floaty marksman with added sustain, great for Clash as well as solos when played well. For this build we take Runic Fluency, Scavenging, and Recovery with Frost offhand and a dash rune. In this case, due to the nature of the Frost Gauntlet, extra movement speed and cast speed is not needed as much as it would be for any other offhand gauntlets, so we can opt for more sustain with Recovery and Scavenging. Runic Fluency sticks on, of course, due to the value it provides for extra rune charges. The main way to play this class is to use 2 wind jumps to get to your maximum height, charge up your Frost, and let it go as soon as you get your Squall buff. This is done very quickly, but so is everything with Tempest. The same can be done with Tornadoes as well. This type of build allows for some big long-range damage and is one of the strongest Tempest builds for Clash. The last build I'll go over is a little bit less meta, but still very useful. This build consists of the talents Spellslinger, Fervor, and Recovery, with any 2 of Fire, Toxic, or Frost. There are a variety of ways this build can work. You can run a Dragonfire build, you can run Fire with Frost for long range, or similarly Toxic with Frost. Spellslinger is there obviously to give you multiple options for your fights, Fervor for increased DPS and movement with Wind Surge, and Recovery for the insane sustain it provides. Overall, a jack-of-all-trades build that you can find a lot of success with. The only problem with this build would have to be the lack of an extra rune charge from a talent like Runic Fluency, which limits your movement a bit, but at least Wind Surge with Fervor does help that a little bit. While ultimately this build is more of a fun one, and it can even be morphed into an avatar build by holding every element in your inventory at once, that variant is definitely not viable in a meta sense, but it is still fun. That about covers the viable builds you can run with Tempest, so now let's get into some advanced techniques with the class. The first technique we have to talk about is everyone's favorite dash tech, and that is Rady Hopping. This is done by spawning a tornado, falling down towards the ground, and dashing in such a way that you skid across the ground just before the tornado's updraft hitbox, and then putting a wind shear for an extra jump. The dash rune conserves all the momentum from your fall speed, dash speed, and updraft, and the wind jump adds a little height on top of that towards the end of the animation. Doing this allows you to reach much higher into the sky, allowing for some insane mobility and also allowing you to see enemies behind certain pieces of cover more easily. Both Talkohsss and Ashenfrost also mention that you can use the tornado to bounce up for an initial updraft while holding a movement input in one direction, and then you can re-enter the tornado for a Rady Hop just before the tornado disappears, so you can get a nice little 2-for-1 use. The second advanced technique I have for you might seem simple at first, but it does take some practice to get used to. Wind running is where you use your wind shears to impulse off of walls while staying grounded in such a way to build up momentum towards your run speed. The way this is done is by inputting only a single left or right direction and rotating your cursor in the same direction that you're moving. Do not press back or it will add extra friction to the momentum transfer, slowing you down significantly. You can use this technique while simply traveling through the Hollowlands or even in the middle of a fight to dodge incoming spells while fleeing. It's also just really fun to do. You can also use the aerial version of this with one change. When you're in the air, you do actually want to input your backward movement. And of course, once you land, you can go back to normal wind running. The third and final technique I'll share with you guys today is a pretty easy one called tornado potting. It's just like drop potting, only in the opposite direction. You spawn a tornado, start sipping your drink, and just let Updraft carry you up into the sky. Now this does come with a caveat. Because you're not inputting any other movement while potting, enemies will have an easier time picking you off with their spells, but it is pretty useful in some niche circumstances such as potting while scaling a building, or if you know the enemy is too distracted with other problems to focus you down in the sky, especially against stone shapers. So learn when to use it and all these techniques to separate yourself from the rest. Alright, now for some final general tips. As a Tempest, your main goal is to dance around your opponents while landing buffed spells and taking little to no damage. This is only achieved if you've mastered the mechanics of Spellbreak, so it is not to be taken lightly. To start, let's talk about the early game. In BR and in Clash, Tempest doesn't really come online until level 3 when you get your Squall skill, so in early fights off the drop, try to kite and avoid damage as much as possible until you get a belt and an offhand gauntlet, and maybe an amulet too. This will give you much more leeway in terms of your sustainability and movement, and this will allow your Wind Gauntlet to mainly be a source of utility and mobility as it is meant to be in this class. That being said, getting into my next tip, don't underestimate the damage that a Squall buffed volley of wind shears offers. We in the community refer to this as wind spam, and while it is a meme, it is also very effective against opponents who are in close range without very much health. Don't be afraid to hold down your mouse button or controller trigger whenever you see a low opponent to close out an easy exile or two. Going into the third tip for you guys, try to be as efficient with your mana as possible. Your wind jumps do cost mana, and if you're not careful with spacing out your shots, you will find yourself out of mana a lot. Generally, it only takes 2 wind shears to reach maximum height, and the slow fall that Wind Surge provides allows you to float at that position for longer than normal. You can use this fact to space out your wind jumps, maintain your Squall buff, and pick your opponent apart with 1 or 2 spells at a time. Another rule of thumb that I like to follow is to use your wind jumps to maintain your hang time until you know that you're going to run out of mana, and then using your tornado when you're recharging your mana. This way you can stay in the air if you need to and recharge your mana at the same time while you're floating. On the other hand, if you spam your tornado too frequently without a good purpose in mind, you might find yourself as a sitting duck on the ground with all the other peasants. And that, my friends, is going to do it for my Tempest guide. Hope you all learned something and enjoyed the video. Special thanks again to Talkohsss and Ashenfrost for some of the more advanced techniques and build suggestions. Talkohsss actually has a Tempest Discord if you can join, with all of the tech and tips we know for the Tempest class up to this point. And also check out their channels, which I'll link down in the description below. So guys, did I miss anything? If you have a tip or two, feel free to post it down in the comments. And also, like I said earlier, if you like the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and go ahead and follow the socials down in the box below. That's going to do it for me. Y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all out there.